So now I'd like to introduce Laurence, who's going to talk about hedgerow wildlife.
Thank you. Okay, so first of all, I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm Laurence Skinnersley. I came into Our Bright Future through the Growing Confidence Project with the Shropshire Wildlife Trust and other partners in the county, and I'm now a Youth Forum rep and youth rep on the steering group. So without further ado, unless we want to go through other introductions. No one seems keen. Okay.
I think we all know each other from previous webinars, so I think we're good to continue.
I think we do. Let's okay. So come on. Slight technical hitch. That was why I was just selecting the wrong window. So if people are happy to if people are happy and feel comfortable talking, I'm going to start with a question, which is simply, what is a hedge? Before I go on, and has anyone got any offers on that?
Does it have a specific height that it has to be under, or?
Not that I've been able to find. Not that I've been able to find. But I mean, I'm going to take a step back here and just say what, in the very broadest sense, is a hedge.
I would say a hedge is a boundary, but I don't know if I'm thinking too theoretically about it.
That's a pretty good answer, really.
Is it like a natural boundary? Is that?
That is an interesting. That word "natural" is a very interesting one. Very interesting one. That's in actual fact, it is probably defined as as being a human feature. So, shall I move on to the list of ideas, list of things that I wrote down? So, as far as I can, so I think from what I've read, and as far as I understand it, these are the sort of 4 ideas that I would come up with. The first thing is a linear woodland. So, a narrow strip of woodland plants, or possibly scrubland plants, is first and foremost what a hedge is. And the second thing is absolutely a boundary, and normally a stock-proof barrier. Hedges, when they were first introduced to our landscape, were introduced to hold in large quadrupeds, basically, or keep out animals that might be a bit of a threat to large quadrupeds. And consequently, unlike a more mature woodland, a hedge will not have gaps in it. It needs to be, or any gaps need to be so small that that a stock animal couldn't force its way out or worm its way out, depending on its sort of size and contortability. And the next thing I would say is, generally speaking, they are not a natural feature in the way that the word natural tends to be defined. They are an anthropogenic feature of the landscape. Typically, they were planted to enclose a piece of land. This is not to say, of course, that they are not valuable for biodiversity, valuable as a conservation priority, because they do, in many respects now, in many landscapes, represent a strip of remarkably species-rich land in a landscape that's generally a bit depleted. I have heard stories from biological surveyors who have surveyed the vegetation of pasture land, and something like 80% of the species that they have, particularly if it's sort of improved grassland, something like 80% of the species that they've recorded have been in the hedgerows. that is specifically plants. But then if 80% of the plants are in the hedgerows, the chances are that animals that are dependent on them, and we'll come back to this later, are going to be much more common. There's a much more abundant, there's a much higher diversity of animals in hedgerows. And the fourth thing that they are, and this is then now getting slightly more technical, is an edge habitat. So we tend to, when we sort of conceptualize the natural world, we divide it up into recognizable habitats. Or if we're just conceptualizing a landscape, for example, we divide it up into habitat types, environments that we're familiar with. But at the boundaries of those, there's going to be a sort of transition zone. And what a hedge is a lot like is the boundary of a woodland, where a woodland meets open territory. Although in the case of most hedges, it's because they are just a narrow strip of trees, it's more like two edges placed back to back. There's no sort of depth of woodland. However, edge habitats are very valuable. There are some plants that will only fruit if they are exposed on one side, for example. There are certain plants that require this certain degree of shading to prosper in any meaningful way. So this makes edge habitats disproportionately valuable for the area that they occupy in terms of biodiversity, in terms of conservation. And until humans came on the scene, they were quite scarce habitats. Now, there is a bit of debate as to what extent the British Isles, and indeed much of Europe, was covered by sort of closed canopy woodland before the arrival of humans in the area. But whatever the case, there was a lot less open territory than there is now, and consequently, a lot less perimeter to that open territory. Now, we've just said that a hedge is a sort of a narrow strip of woodland, a linear woodland. And so, like any woodland, it has a height structure. So that's illustrated quite well by, this is actually the by this diagram, which is actually the structure of a forest garden, but it illustrates the principles well enough of low-level flora on the ground, and a sort of understory of shrubby plants, and then a canopy of much larger trees. Now, in the context of a hedge, much of it will actually be part of the, let me see if I can I've learnt a new trick. Much of it will be in this low tree layer, or possibly the shrub or herbaceous plant layer. There will be a few what might regard as canopy or maybe emergent trees. These are often called standard trees by foresters and horticulturalists. And they stick up above the main body of the hedge, which, although I don't know of a sort of maximum height, that will tend to be not much in excess of 2 meters. Possibly 3. It also depends on what you're trying to contain, of course. If you're containing sheep, then a sort of closely spaced hawthorn hedge of 1.5 meters height would probably be okay. If you're trying to contain thoroughbred steeplechase racehorses, you'll probably want something a bit higher. And so, to a certain extent, again, it's an anthropogenic feature. It does depend a little bit on what it was designed to contain. So, my next question, if people, again, if you feel confident offering an answer, how many species of all kinds can be found in a hedge? you won't be at all um, uh, judged for coming up with something that's way off the mark, because I did when I first when I was first presented with this question.
200.
That's a reasonable. I mean, a very good, well-versed field naturalist would probably identify fewer than that in a hedgerow. But that's what you could. But that's what you could identify in the field.
1,000.
That's getting closer, and that's you would probably need a highly skilled team of people to identify 1,000 species. But even discounting what we might broadly call microorganisms, there is there's a we are still thinking a vast number. Shall I? Do you want to have a guess, Lydia? Don't blame you. So, the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust at one point said, I don't know what the date of this statement is actually, that up to 1,506 species can be found in hedgerows. That was their statement. However, a Devon-based all-round naturalist published, whose name escapes me, I'll check his name before we sign off this, published an article in the British Wildlife Journal a few years ago to the effect that in a single 90-metre stretch of Devon hedge, now that's a statement of structure as much as geography. A Devon hedge is characterised by having a ditch, beside which there is a large mound that was, the mound or embankment that was produced by the clearing out of the ditch, on which the hedgerow trees are planted. And in Devon, beech is tends to be quite dominant. So in a single 90-metre stretch of Devon hedge, this was a survey conducted over 2 years, 1,718 insect species have been identified as of 2016, with quite a number of others awaiting identification in store boxes in the Natural History Museum. In total, in all the groups surveyed, 2,070 identified species, and a possible estimate for the total number was given as 3,000. And this was including all of the macro plants, all of the vascular plants. It included all insects as far as possible, although those were the ones that were causing the most trouble. It included mollusks, it included vertebrates. So this is predominantly mammals and birds in hedgerows. And it included things like gastropods, so slugs and snails. What it failed to include, which would push this total up even further, just because this would have been extraordinarily difficult, is things like microfungi, like rusts that tend to digest the dead tissues of plants. Things like mildews, which very commonly affect the leaves of hedgerow trees. And sort of small animals that are difficult to identify, like nematodes and rotifers and those kinds of invertebrates. Now, so that is that particular stretch of Devon hedge was probably maybe an above average example, but nevertheless, it suggests that the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust 1,500 insect species in hedgerows generally is a bit of an underestimate. So then, now in any environment, the foundation is, for any sort of community type, the foundation is formed by a series of sort of static organisms. Now, form the structure of the habitat. Now, in a hedgerow, that is trees, although trees that have been cut in such a way as to keep them in a sort of multi-branched, possibly multi-stemmed form, more like a bush form. But all of these species could form freestanding trees if they were allowed to. Now, by far and away, the commonest is hawthorn. Now, hawthorn has been used for millennia in hedgerows. There's good evidence that it was planted up to form field boundaries in Romantic British times and before. Incidentally, the prevalence of enclosures has sort of waxed and waned over the centuries, certainly in Britain at any rate. Up until about the 8th century AD, enclosed fields were very common. Then they sort of gave way in England and Wales, or across much of England and Wales, to open field farming practices for the best part of 1,000 years. But then the hedgerows were brought back after the Enclosure Acts in the 18th century. A further 2 centuries later, a lot of hedgerows were then grubbed up to allow agricultural machinery with big fields that required big fields, and didn't do well with plants that might obstruct it a bit, which has proven to be, as is quite well recorded, a bit of an ecological disaster, and indeed an agricultural disaster as well. In any event, hawthorn dominated hedges, make up roughly a third of hedgerows, but they have been recorded or estimated to exist in some 94% of hedgerows, just as some component. Now, bear in mind that this could be quite a large component. Like, according to the technical definition, a beech hedge can be up to 40% hawthorn. And hawthorns, although a monoculture is generally reviled in sort of conservation and reviled by ecologists, hawthorns do support a relatively large number of insect species. They support a number of galls. One of the more common galls are a tissue that's been produced by the plant, or a structure that another organism has forced the plant to produce, either as a nursery for its offspring or just as a habitat for itself, really. And a lot of these are produced by insects laying their eggs in the tissue of the plant, and the insect will produce a sort of chemical signal that forces the plant to produce its own. A particularly common gall in the hawthorn causes the leaf buds to sort of the terminal leaf buds to swell into a sort of a rather odd crenellated shape, and that's caused by a species of midge, which itself is then then targeted by a particular wasp species, that sort of a human parasitoid wasp that lays its eggs into the gall. The larva of the wasp will then eat the larva of the midge and take over the gall and then hatch it itself. And it is, of course, all of these insects, which in this case are all rather dependent on hawthorn, that attract in many of the bird species that we so associate with hedgerows. Now, the second most common hedgerow plant is blackthorn.
Laurence, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go on.
So I have a really silly question. So are you saying that hawthorn tree, well, the hawthorn hedge could go into a tree, but the way it's been maintained means that it's only a hedge shape or only grows to a hedge height, because that's what it's been told to do, as it were, by humans?
So if you, I've got a few images at the end of hedge management, but in short, if you cut a plant, particularly most plants grow from the tips, and they have a plant hormone, a growth factor that is produced at the growing tip and prevents any sort of any growth from further down the stem. If you cut that tip away, the effect is to cause buds further down the stem to burst, which first of all makes a much smaller, denser plant, but it also traps the plant at one particular stage of development. So if left alone, a hawthorn will grow into quite a big a sizable freestanding tree with a single trunk and no lower branches. I've seen freestanding hawthorns with no branches below my head height, for example. But there are various management techniques that can be employed to maintain in principle, any tree grade plant, but particularly, some respond better to others, and both hawthorn and blackthorn here respond quite well to such management techniques as hedge laying. And those are quite important because they maintain a habitat that would otherwise disappear. Particularly anything that requires sort of partial shading, any plants that require partial shading will struggle if the hedge grows up into. I've got some images actually I can send out if you like, of what happens if a hedge isn't managed, and you just end up with just sort of a row of freestanding what are often called standard trees. And you can actually see that a little bit. There's one in this image. I'm not sure exactly what species this is, but you notice there that certainly this hedge compared to this hedge has not been managed. Looks as if it's not been managed as intensively. That almost looks like a row of blackthorn scrub actually. So on the left, hawthorn is the most common. Blackthorn is the second most common in British hedges. It's in about somewhere between 24 and 27% of hedges. And I think that blackthorn dominated hedges are, I think it's something like 3 or 4% of all the hedges, maybe be more than that, of all the hedges in existence. But again, there's a almost arbitrary definition as to what constitutes hawthorn dominated, blackthorn dominated, beech dominated, whatever. Again, this is a little bit of a monoculture hedge, and hedges, certainly near where I live, hedges that consist largely of hawthorn or blackthorn, or a combination of the two, are remarkably common. Partly again because they grow quickly. So hawthorn in particular will grow quickly and will form a barrier quickly, or an effective barrier. But again, they do support. Hawthorn in particular does support quite a large insect community, which in turn means that it supports a large bird community. A more varied hedge is more valuable, but monocultures like this have a value at least. Now, the third tree that's very common forming the structure of hedgerows is the hazel. And hazel again grows rapidly. So this is the most common species of hazel is Corylus avellana. I need to brush up on my Latin pronunciation. But yes, grows very rapidly. Grows multi-stemmed often, which is again quite good for producing a barrier, and tends to respond very well to traditional hedge management practices. It too supports a wide variety of insects. It's also, of course, widely associated with the hazel dormouse, although I don't know of hedgerows being particularly conducive to the dormouse. There is one other tree that, there are practically any tree, it should be said, can be found in hedgerows. They're not, for the most part, they're not planted. These first three represent the most regularly planted hedgerow trees, but almost any can set themselves into a hedgerow. often there's an awful lot of apple trees of various kinds that find their way into hedgerows, normally from discarded apple cores, as it happens, rather than any other method. Just a farm labourer disposing conveniently of an apple core is the source of many apple trees in hedgerows. And elms have often been a major hedgerow species in the past. The one that I think is deserving of mention of the less common hedgerow trees is the oak. Now, most commonly, oaks in hedgerows are what are sometimes called, more often called standard trees. Now, these two oaks are strictly in the hedgerow. I believe this is in Norfolk. But it will be noticed that they are considerably taller than the average height of the trees in that hedge. The rest of them, I think, are hawthorn. And again, we often imagine oaks again. This is obviously a bit, obviously a spring or summer image. Again, this oak is considerably taller than the hedges around it, although it looks like it's been a little bit ravaged to me. The reason that I mention oaks is that they support a vastly greater insect community and sort of an otherwise dependent plant community than any other tree that's often regularly found in hedgerows. They support far more gall-forming organisms, so mainly, for the most part, wasps and flies, than any other tree, to the extent that they have, in the standard textbook, if you like, the field guide to the galls of British trees, they have a whole chapter devoted to them. Now, this is partly due to longevity. Oaks live for a long period of time. As they mature, they produce a wide variety of different habitats. And there are many galls, and the many galls that are associated with them, one of the more familiar is the oak apple, which is a sort of sphere that forms on the leaf. Other galls form bizarre sort of wrinkled structures in place of the acorns that have, in that case, a female wasp has inserted her egg into the oak flower and triggered, before it was fertilized, and triggered the oak to, instead of produce an acorn, produce a sort of shriveled structure that is almost indescribable, but I don't know, beautiful in its own way. Now, obviously, as we've just said, if left to their own devices, the kind of plants that make up the structure of a hedge will then grow to form standard trees, not unlike this. And indeed, this hazel is more of a standard tree than a hedgerow tree. Often, I should say, you can find oaks as well in a sort of bush form inside hedges. From the distribution of the ones I've seen around lanes in Shropshire, they look like they've been self-set. They're sort of they stand out remarkably in hedges that are mainly hazel and hawthorn. In some cases, even ivy is very common. Can be very common in hedges. Which, of course, is a plant with wonderful wildlife value in its own right, as a hedge plant with it's a fantastic nectar source at a time of year when there isn't very much, and a fantastic nesting habitat for a great many birds because it's just so dense and tangled. So,
Laurence?
Yes.
Sorry, so having a standard tree, is that kind of practice because it can allow for insects to kind of travel from the tree into the hedgerow? Does it allow for more species when you have a standard, however many meters long?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, a mature tree, whatever its species, will support a different insect community and therefore a different vertebrate community, perhaps. Yeah, as in, for example, certain bird species, I think tree creepers and woodpeckers, great spotted woodpeckers, for example, will be hunting certain insects beneath the bark of older trees. So absolutely, it would have that effect. Yes. I don't know about whether historically, and that it certainly has conservation value for that reason. And whether though in the past they were simply incorporated into hedgerows because they would have been time consuming or expensive to remove, I'm not sure. In the days when hedgerows have been considered primarily or exclusively as boundaries. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. So obviously a standard tree creates a rather different series of microhabitats, and so we will want a few in a hedgerow, but primarily we want to hedges that generally want to be maintained as exactly that, a sort of continuous line of vegetation. And so there are a number of methods for doing that, and one of the more traditional methods which was used widely is hedge laying, which you may be familiar with. This involves cutting slightly off vertical cut, known as a pleach, into each of the hedge trees once they get above a certain height. In this case, there will usually, if you're laying, usually be single-stemmed trees. Otherwise, this is a bit difficult. And will be lay, and this again, I believe, this is in Norfolk. I'm not entirely certain which style this is. This is not my photograph. So these trees have been cut at this angle, at a sort of near vertical angle, and laid down with some of the vascular bundles here, some of the xylem and phloem, just below the bark there, allowed to continue from the rootstock upwards, so that the plant will continue growing. This form of management stimulates the plant to continue growing in the form that it has been growing in, as a sort of a shrub form, but which creates a sort of more interlinked boundary. But it also creates this essentially a section of dead material around the base of the hedge, which is quite difficult for an animal like a bullock, for example, to force its way through. There's a number of different styles, and they tend to vary. Well, historically they vary by region, and it tended to depend a little bit, first of all, on what kind of plants you were laying, but even more so really on what you were trying to contain. So the style that I've inexpertly used in the past in Shropshire has largely been what's often called Midland Bullock style, and as the name suggests, it's designed to contain powerfully muscled bovids. And so one of the sort of key pieces of equipment, or key pieces of the structure of a laid hedge, is a series of stakes that the hedging plants are woven in and out of. And the weave in Midland style the Midland style laid hedge tends to be rather looser, but it tends to be rather more bulky material, because that's designed to contain cattle that will exert a lot of force on a hedge, but won't tend to find small gaps. Other styles, like a style typically used in mid Wales, is a much tighter weave, because that tends to be designed to contain sheep, which will search for gaps. Now, this is very good for stimulating growth, and tends to be often used as just a conservation technique with no other thoughts in mind, because it creates those habitats. For example, particularly dead wood habitats down towards the base of the hedge. Deadwood is a hugely underrated habitat, because a lot of this stuff that's been cut, that's been laid, will then ultimately rot as a sort of a bank of dead wood, while maintaining the sort of early growth habitat, if you like, almost like an early growth forest habitat. However, this is quite time consuming and an awful lot and labour intensive, and so an awful lot of hedges get managed in this way. Now, this is another reason why hawthorn tends to get used very widely, because it's reasonably resistant to being flailed like this, or reasonably tolerant of being flailed like this, perhaps I should say. Now, in a sense, for the species that are dependent on hawthorn in this particular form, this flailing is better than no management at all. However, it does have a tendency to leave open an awful lot of live bark, far more so than these pleaches do. Pleach cutting does. That has the issue of leaving the hedge open to fungal infections. It also has a bit of a tendency to remove far greater quantities of wood than the hedge can regenerate in the time between flailings. So if hedges are flailed like this regularly, it has a tendency to just sort of cut the hedge. It could cut the hedge back to nothing, although I think most landowners are pretty wise to that. This is not ideal, and it can also have very detrimental effects on animals using the hedge, as might be imagined. Now, I'm quite aware of a number of people, certainly within the Shropshire Trust, who are talking to local farmers to try and persuade them to reduce or abandon this particular form of management, because it is not ideal. And try to move towards traditional forms of management that are a bit more sympathetic to our wildlife and to the local ecological communities. Now, to finish my piece, I've just noticed that we have run for a bit longer than than scheduled. I'll just draw my piece to a close with this a quick brief mention of hedges as corridors. Now, they're often sort of trumpeted as wildlife corridors. Now, for whether this is true is an interesting question. It's been calculated that in terms of the way that plants disperse, the average hedgerow plant, now we're not just talking the trees here, we could also talk herbaceous plants like convolvulus bindweed, for example, and ivy, and other plants that colonize the hedge as it develops. In many cases, they tend to disperse along hedgerows at a rate of about 1 metre per year. So it would take it, if we were talking, say, 2 patches of woodland on either side of a farm, it would take a lot of hedgerow plants a remarkably long time to cross the farm. Now, in terms of insects, most of them can fly, and most of them are not overly concerned about crossing open ground. So whether it's relevant to them, again, is a dubious question. Similarly, a lot of the fungi that are very common in hedges are dispersed by spores that are just carried on the wind. Incidentally, many fungi do sort of what traditionally regarded as woodland fungi do benefit in hedges, because they tend to fruit only when they're exposed to light, and that is largely because they have evolved to respond to light, because it tends to correlate quite well with moving wind, or moving air, which is what they need to disperse their spores. And again, in a hedgerow, in relatively open country, there's more of there's more scope for that, and so fungi are more likely to be certain woodland fungi are more likely to be able to disperse. along this edge habitat. Among those that almost certainly do use hedgerows as corridors, there's an argument for saying that perhaps invertebrates that can't fly, so organisms like snails, for example, could use them as dispersal routes. And others such as mammals, so potentially there's some evidence to suggest that voles and mice use them as highways, and it's often it's often ascertained, although it's often claimed, although the evidence for this is, I understand, a little bit, well, it has been criticised. The evidence claimed for this has been criticised, that bats use hedgerows as navigational and dispersal aids, and I understand that a lot of studies support this, some don't. Now, that brings me to the end of my prepared talk, and I'm willing to, if there's time, I'm willing for an open discussion.
Yeah, thank you for that, Laurence. That was really interesting. I definitely won't look at a hedgerow the same way again. I don't have any questions, but does anyone else?
What made you pick hedgerows, Laurence?
The biggest thing really is that when I first got involved with the Growing Confidence Project, the first I mean, I've been going. Obviously we have monthly work parties with the Wildlife Trust, and I've been going to those for a while. And one of the very first, I think it may even have been the second or third event that we had at FSC Preston Montfort, certainly it was the first one that I went to, was about hedgerows and about the natural history of hedgerows. And I had exactly that experience. I sort of suddenly became aware of this whole world that I'd just sort of been cycling past and walking past and more or less completely ignoring. And that made me want to sort of just pass that on, really.
Cool.
I have a question about keeping, the trees to the hedge height. I think I often see beech in hedges, and I'm always really surprised by how it can be so small. Is it simply just coppicing, or like do you have to wait for the kind of small tree to have a few branches and then you snip those, or can you just coppice it? And does it need to be like, can you just do it once and that's it, or like is it a consistent thing?
Now, I don't know a lot specifically about beech because I've not been involved with the management of sort of beech-dominated hedges. But certainly, laying is something that is done repeatedly. So it would, to the best of my knowledge of the way trees grow, you would need to carry on. Management. It would eventually grow into a standard tree if it was left. Now, depending on where it is, in some cases it will have been flailed like this. I suspect that the beech hedges that I see around Shropshire lanes are probably being flailed like this just because all the hawthorn hedges clearly are. In terms of management styles, one management style that's sometimes used by horticulturalists is simply to cut the tree down a little bit, just give the tree a bit of a haircut, and that has a tendency to make it put out more side branches, but it also has a tendency to make it mature more quickly and sort of push it on towards senescence, basically. The hedge laying has the effect of maintaining the tree at a sort of early stage in its development. Sort of maintaining the tree in its adolescence, if you like. I'm not sure how good an analogy that is, but because it sort of it's like almost like a tricking of the tree into it still being at an earlier stage in its life. By just sort of tweaking the environmental conditions around it. I mean, I must say that a laid hedge does look like a devastated hedge at first, but it does grow back remarkably quickly. A bit like coppicing. But yes, you're right. It is the principle is much the same as coppicing in terms of many hedge management techniques. Yeah.
And also just like the flailing thing, because I have done some natural hedge management as well, and I did think when we were doing that, but I kind of must have forgotten like how do you manage hedges normally, like surely, so when they do that, it's just basically just cutting the edges and that's kind of it, and they cut the tops, and is that kind of all they do?
As from what I've seen, that is all they do.
Yeah.
And looking at the sort of I mean, obviously this is all a bit based on the product. They would seem to have. I mean, if you're looking at, I'm trying to gesture with my hand, which you can't see. I mean, just looking at sort of the range of this device here, it's not going to get a hell of a lot lower than it is at the moment, and they could probably strim along the top. It also tends to produce hedges of remarkably sort of regular geometric shapes, almost like like a trapezium in cross section. Because I suppose what they must do is work down the hedge several times with this flail at certain angles and heights, which means that you tend to produce a hedge that's been squared off, almost a bit like a sort of a but like a sort of a certain railway carriages or something like that. But yes, I think it's a labour-saving and rather brutal way of doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, but so, thank you. Just on from that, would you say that this probably isn't something you could do in the early stages of the hedge, like in the hedge's life? Like this would have to be once a hedge is like mature and it's actually a hedge, you'd only really be able to do this, or?
Yeah, you. I mean, and in fact, I mean, this might again be part of the reason why they choose to use hawthorns, because hawthorns tend to grow in this sort of rather dense, tangled form anyway. I can't really see you flailing sort of what would effectively be like a coppice stall of hazel, if you were to plant hazel, for example. And yes, I think that you've got that you've got a very good point there. That I don't think young saplings or certainly not seedlings, the kind of sort of the whips that would have originally been planted wouldn't respond very well to being flailed. I wouldn't have thought. I think it would probably kill them.
Cool, thank you.
Okay.